So, this week in the Sacred Gathering, we're going to be looking at Psalm 124. This is a psalm that's one of the Psalms of Ascent, so it means that they were probably pilgrim songs, songs that were very obviously designed for kind of liturgical use. I would say this psalm is one that is meant to kind of form us in a certain way, and this psalm is going to talk a lot about kind of fear and trust. And I was just struck as I'm looking at that, I think this psalm is a very helpful one to us who live in a very neurotic, a very anxious culture in which we have information thrown at us all the time, and yet there's not a lot we can do with it sometimes. And so we just kind of this tension, this fear of what can go wrong, what is going wrong with us. And I think into that kind of a situation, which is a pretty normal one for the human race, I think this psalm is speaking. So let me read Psalm 124 and then we can get some thoughts on it. If it had not been the Lord who was on our side, let Israel now say, if it had not been the Lord who was on our side, when people rose up against us, then they would have swallowed us up alive, when their anger was kindled against us. Then the flood would have swept us away, the torrent would have gone over us. Then over us would have gone the raging waters. Blessed be the Lord, who has not given us as prey to their teeth. We have escaped like a bird from the snare of the fowlers. The snare is broken, and we have escaped. Our help is in the name of the Lord, who made heaven and earth. So, beautiful, simple little psalm, and yet there's a lot there. So let's go through it kind of a little more slowly and just kind of think through what is maybe some of the significance of different parts of this. So the first part of the psalm, people have tried to identify looking at words or references if there is kind of a historical moment that is being addressed here, that the people are thankful that God has saved them. And I would say that there are not any very convincing answers. I think it is left kind of more vague, so all of us can find ourselves in it. There are moments in all of our lives when we find ourselves in a place that is very similar to that. And I would say the place that this psalm is trying to put us in, the place the psalm is trying to remind us of, is one that we as humans do almost anything we can to avoid being in it. And that is in a position where we are exposed, where our defenses are down, where we are vulnerable, where we can be hurt. We go to such great lengths to make sure that we are never in this place. And yet this psalm is one about when we find ourselves in that place. And so let's take a second look at some of the kind of metaphors and what they might be referring to just real quickly before we return to that idea. So verses 2 and 3 say, if it had not been the Lord who was at our side, when the people rose up against us, then they would have swallowed us up alive. Then their anger was kindled against us. So there's kind of two main metaphors being used in there, and this idea of kindle, one of fire, and there's several words used around anger or rising up that all have kind of fire metaphors. So yeah, obviously fire works well with anger and destruction. It's something that we fear. It's something that's incredibly damaging to those around us, and so that's there. But there's an even stronger metaphor for who describing these people are, because we're not told if it's enemies within, we're not told if it's enemies in another country. It could be almost anyone, right? And yet this metaphor that he uses of swallowing us up alive. In the Old Testament, this is one of the favorite metaphors for the grave, for what they would have called Sheol, their kind of underworld. For death, it's this image of some kind of a monster, swooping up and eating people. And one of the comments I was reading this week said, this people, whoever they are those who have allied themselves with death. They are in fact using the same metaphors of being a monster that's gobbling things up. And I liked that phrase. These people, whoever they are, when people rose up against us in their fiery anger, these are the people who ally themselves with death, with the things that are anti-God. These are the ones who are allying. And this can be, this can be big things. It can be those who very literally are having malice, foreign enemies, those who are attacking us, those who would harm us if they could, right? But I think for most of us, we're going to find some more subtle versions in our culture, in the life around us, of those people who are allying themselves with death. Maybe it's just the people around us that view other members of humanity as some kind of a resource, stepping stones to get what they want. Maybe it's in a workplace, or maybe it's politically, right? They don't really care about how this affects people as long as they get the votes they want. They don't care about what this product actually does to people as long as they're able to sell it, right? Those who see people as something that they can get something out of, or maybe also those who see people as barriers, those who have dreams and goals and want to do something great with their lives or society, and people are in the way. Therefore, we need to shovel them aside. How much damage and malice is from those who see people as expendable, whether as a resource or as something in the way, or it might be something even as small as the number of problems in our world caused by kind of petty selfishness. Think about the last time you were stuck in traffic, right? And if people wouldn't cut in and out, wouldn't try to be speeding ahead, wouldn't try to take care of themselves for everyone else, if everyone would just kind of get along and do what maybe works best for the most people, how different of a world would we live in? And I would argue all of these, whether it's very direct, very violent and dangerous, down to these little pettinesses that make the world a harder place to be in, all of these are people who ally themselves with death and unlife and things that are anti-God. And this is something that we have to be very cautious to keep out of our own lives, but it's surrounded by us everywhere. And they and we very much can be exposed and vulnerable and, around harm because of this stance in the world around us. The next one, the flood, in verses 4 and 5 says, "The flood would have swept us away, the torrent would have gone over us, then over us would have gone the raging waters." Flooding metaphors, which of course are very personal for me, having lost a house and a lot of things in a flood. But floods in the Bible almost always represent kind of like primordial chaos. The world returning to anarchy, the world returning to just people at their absolute worst. And so the floodwaters, these things that can overwhelm us that God is protecting us from in this section, I think it can be things like natural disasters, right? These things that are just so utterly beyond us and our resources to handle. I think you could throw in kind of man-made disasters in that too, or human-made disasters. The systems we make, right? We wish we could live slower, simpler lives. We wish we could, have more justice in where our food comes from. We wish people could be treated more fairly and it was a fair shot for everybody. And yet in all those places are these things that feel like they were made by people, and yet they also feel out of control. It doesn't feel like I can push back. It doesn't feel like I can do anything about it as much as I want. And sometimes we even find that within ourselves, right? What we simply call addiction. I wish I didn't do that thing. I wish I didn't talk to people that way. I wish I didn't reach for whatever vice you want to say to make myself feel better after a long, hard day. I wish I could be different. I wish I could stop. That's the floodwaters. Those are the things that are in over our head. And in both of these cases, whether it's a world that is allied with death, whether it is, things within or without that are overwhelming and too big and we cannot handle, whether we're in this place where we are exposed as small and weak and not having enough, where we are vulnerable in places of danger. In each of those places, this psalm is reminding us, blessed be the Lord. And yet, the psalm continues with this very iconic image of the bird in the snare, right? Blessed be the Lord, who has not given us as prey to their teeth. We have escaped like a bird from the snare of the fowlers. The snare is broken, and we have escaped. This image is slightly different than the ones earlier, in that the ones earlier, both the flood, the fire, the people around that are causing harm, it said, if it wasn't the Lord who's at our side, then these bad things might have happened to us. It's again kind of that worrying, what if this had happened? What if things had gone the way we didn't want them to? But they didn't. And yet this one we've gotten ourselves into kind of redemption language, right? That's the language in the Bible that likes to talk about the need to be pawned back when we've sold ourselves to something. It's ransom language. We've been kidnapped and taken, and now God has to pay a price to bring us back. If the first two are about worrying something bad is going to happen to us and hoping that God can be there, this image is the bad things have happened. Whether it's our fault, whether it's the fault of the world around, bad things have happened, and it doesn't look like we're going to be able to get away. It doesn't look like we're going to be able to escape from the prison, the situation we find ourselves in. And yet again, God is there. And I think this section talks about, again, not just that we're afraid something's going to happen. It has actually happened. We are not just vulnerable. We have now experienced harm. We have now experienced hurt and those sorts of things. And yet, even when we're right there, right when we're getting away by the skin of our teeth, we get verse 8, our help is in the name of the Lord who made heaven and earth. And this idea of our help, I think, is the kind of key point that this entire psalm is aiming at. Our help, what we will rely on, what we are going to trust. When there are many other things in the world, when there's maybe many other things we would prefer to trust and to rely on to keep us from being vulnerable, to keep us from being in harm's way, right? Because I think we need to recognize in ourselves that we are tempted by many other things. There's many other things besides God that we would rather trust in than in God. Maybe it's our own intelligence. Maybe it's our bank accounts. Maybe it's the people around us. Maybe it's just, the whole systems. How much evil in the world is caused by people who are unwilling to be vulnerable, are unwilling to be in a place where if I protect myself, nothing can get me, nothing can hurt me, nothing can show me up as small or unintelligent, or nothing can get me, right? How much evil in the world comes from people protecting themselves and those like them, or being able to lash out, or making sure I've got enough for me, which, sorry, but that means there isn't enough for you and everyone else, right? How much of that evil in the world comes from that? And I think because of that fear, because that is lurking behind us, so much of the time we are going to try to twist passages like this that say, if it hadn't been the Lord who was at our side, if it hadn't been the Lord at our side, right? God's presence is here. And where we want to try to take it is saying, okay, if God is present, then bad things simply won't happen, right? If I pray really hard, if I tithe, if I'm involved in the church, if I do my part, bad things are not going to happen in my life. And then when they do, we feel betrayed. We feel angry. We feel frustrated with God. It's like, why did this happen? I did my part. Why aren't you doing your part? That is not what this psalm says. This is not what so many other places say. It doesn't say God's presence is going to keep these things from happening. It's saying when these things are happening, God's presence is going to be enough, right? And so I think we need to confess to ourselves, not so much that we don't want to trust God, we don't want God's presence, it's that we don't want to need God's presence. We don't want to be in a place or world where we are vulnerable, where we can be exposed as who we actually are, where we could get hurt. I think we would much rather a world where we don't even need anything from God. Everything just works out. And that's not the world that is ever promised. It's not the world that we're talking about here, because that's not the real world. We are small. We're not smart enough. We're never going to have enough resources. We have to trust in God. We have to say our help is in the name of the Lord, not in these other things. And that is what we are being reminded of in this psalm, that beautifully, when we trust in the Lord, when we have these experiences, our help is in the name of the Lord who made heaven and earth, right? As much as God shows himself in his creativity and his power in the world, this psalm is going to remind us that God primarily wants to be seen as a savior, as one who acts, as one who rescues people. And again we hear it, whether it's from people's anger, whether it's from floods, whether it's something that needs redemption. It's already too late. We're there. God shows himself again and again and again as worthy of our praise, of thankfulness when we're willing to look at it, that God can save us. God can do things. God is enough. And as much as we would rather a life that we never need God, that's not real. We're never going to have that thing. And the lengths that humanity often is willing to go to try to achieve that leads us to some very dark places that ultimately are dead ends. And this psalm, I think, is speaking to the opposite, saying, if it hadn't been the Lord who was at our side, all these things would have happened. Therefore, our help is in the name of the Lord who made heaven and earth. That's who we're going to trust. None of these other things which will fail us ultimately. No matter the situation, our help, our trust is in God.